Okay, so we're about to launch the background on why I did this and why it's important to you. So for years I wanted to find a way that the patients could contribute to their own recovery, and what I experienced was that patients that come in to see me have areas of their spine that are restricted, and along with those areas of restriction decreases the amount of mobility or flexibility in their whole spine. But along those areas of restriction in the spine, what we also found was the muscles related to that area that work with that area have serious problems too. They don't move properly. They're either short, tight, tender, or a combination of all three of those. And I wanted to find a way where the patient could jump in and actually help with moving those areas. I'm really good at getting those things going again, but keeping them going and changing the pattern is the most important part to having a complete recovery of the patient's problem. So what we found was that not only along with the areas of motion that are restricted, that we find that areas where restriction meets an area of motion that also contributes to a problem. So let's take a look at this. So if this is your spine, a representative, and each one of these balls represents a vertebrae, as we move, each vertebrae should move along with it. Now what we find is we get areas of restriction. In other words, the vertebrae are not moving well, or they're abnormally moving, or they're moving excessively, like where the restricted area meets the area of movement, you get a lot more movement than you would if you just had a freely movable area. And again, along the area of restriction, we're finding areas of muscle problems. In other words, tightness in the muscles, shortness in the muscles, weakness, imbalance from side to side, all kinds of different problems. Now, what we did to get the patients to participate in this, we went back to how the spine works. In other words, this comes from chiropractic biophysics, Dr. Don Harris, and we know from his work that there's different directions of motion in the spine. Spines move in straight lines and they move in circular motion. So those are the principal motions that they move in the directions of motion. Now there's also planes of movement. In other words, the spine can move up and down, it can move side to side, it can move forward and backwards, and it can move in combinations of those, and combinations of linear motions and circular motions. In other words, the point of this is that there's a lot of different possibilities of motions. Now, the other thing is that there are centers of motion in the spine, and those are the areas that we target to start the patient to appreciate the motion there is in the spine. And so they start with the pelvis. We use that as a center of motion. And then as we move up, we go to the mid-lumbar spine, and that's another center of motion, number 2. Number 3 is where the lumbar spine that is bent forward meets the thoracic spine that has a bend backward, and that's a transitional area, and that's another center of movement. And as we move up higher, the area between the shoulder blades is another target area of problems in the spines. And the 5th one is in the just a little bit lower than the center of the neck, around the 5th cervical segment in the neck, and that's another transitional area that we use to direct motion. Now there's certain principles of motion, and in order to make this effective, we use certain principles that have been proven in other ways. In other words, we want the brain to pay attention to what we're doing, so the brain will work with us in getting the movement patterns going in those areas of the spine, so you can actually control and feel the movement in the area of the spine. So the first one is minimal movements. So we don't do an exaggerated movement, we do a very, very tiny movement, and that's why I call this micro movement meditation. Because it's almost a meditative movement. You move very, very slightly. And again, forward, backward, side to side. But they're very, very tiny movements. If you're straining to make it move, then you're not moving the right way. The next one is that we have to keep the range of motion in a range of most ease. In other words, again, we don't push it too far forward or too far backwards or rotate it too much. We just feel that nice feeling of comfort as we're moving. In other words, tell the brain what you want, not what you don't want. You want to tell your brain to feel strain. You want to tell your brain to feel ease, so that you are in total control of that movement. The next one is very, very slow movements. In other words, you don't want to move quickly. The slower we move with the movements, the better it is for us to control the movements, because there's more attention that the brain has to pay to that area. And by slowing the brain down, we actually get the brain to work with us, and it is much, much more effective in the movement. The other one is varied movements. the more different we can make the movements, the more the brain has to pay attention to what's going on. So these are all part of getting the brain to pay close attention to what's going on, making the movement very, very easy, and allowing the brain to participate with us and help us with those movements. Because in effect, we're not training the spinal movements, we're training the brain, because the brain actually has control over those movements. Now, as we go into looking at and practicing those movements, we're going to keep those principles in mind, and we're going to remember those to target those different areas of the spine so that we can remove those restrictions and allow you to take control of your spine and work with it.